Chapter 7 The Cube of Conscience. New Ethics for the Third Millennium. What is conscience? Conscience is the utmost realm for a human. For a person, the highest triumph. The ideal is to conquer, is to cultivate his conscience. When the conscience is cultivated, all the essences that are important align as an individual, as a member of his society, and as the main actor in his projects. The result of cultivating one's conscience is to improve oneself, to advance our surroundings, and to achieve our goals and projects. To be a better person, to have a successful projects, and to improve the world around is the end result of cultivating our conscience. El Chapo realized his projects and improved himself and his family, but he did so while destroying the lives of millions. The genocidal drug lord cannot qualify as a conscious human being, nor can Hillary Clinton, who made an inaccurate assessment of the political environment in the election race of 2017. As a result of this inaccuracy, she lost the election. Her projects created bitterness and division among her followers and detractors. She did not address the people's concerns and lost the presidency to Donald Trump, leaving behind a very divided country. Conscience necessarily involves self-improvement, improvement of the surroundings, and the realization of one's projects. Conscience is tridimensional. Conscience begins by acknowledging our existence. I am, I exist, I desire. I belong to an environment, which is my circumstance. In my context, I am an actor and I want to understand it, face it, or change it via my projects. After I acknowledge that I exist, that I am part of an environment, it's time to interact with it. First, I need to grasp it using my senses. I need to perceive it, interpret it, analyze it, and understand it. Finally, after acknowledging myself and my circumstance, I need to coexist with it, and that means to have projects. Therefore, the conscience moves in the tridimensional cube. It has three essences: I, my circumstance, and my projects, just like everything else in this tridimensional world. Ordered. In a thriving environment, I live in joy, accomplishing my projects and objectives. The concept of I. I am capable of coding and deciphering tridimensional realities. My circumstance interacts with me in the tridimensional space over time, and my projects are my response. My intention to interact with my circumstance and transform it. That is why everything begins with the perception of myself, the space-time, and the circumstance that surrounds me. Perception is also a tridimensional process that has three essences: the information that my senses grasp from reality, the interpretation that I give to that information, and finally, how deeply it matches my projects and desires. If I am not altered, then my perception will likely be correct and match my desires. It then becomes more likely that my projects will be successful. I will interact better with my environment and improve it, and I will approach happiness. If on the contrary I am altered and grasp information erroneously, that will create a poor interpretation of reality, which in turn will be opposed to my desires, and my projects will falter. One gets closer to suffering. Order. I have a clear perception, a precise interpretation, and a thriving interaction. The cube of I. Joy. Precise. Perception. Clear and adequate. Interpretation. Unfitting. Chaos. I have a turbid perception, an unfitting interpretation, and inadequate interaction. Despair. Perception. Perception is a tridimensional process that occurs in time, and therefore it can be mapped in uCUbe. Perception has three essences: one immediate that happens in the present, one that is rooted in past experiences, then lastly, a future one that is in sync with the desires. The human being grasps his surroundings with his six senses. Those senses are sight, taste, smell, hearing, touch, and energy. People who consume drugs or alcohol cannot have a righteous perception because they grasp reality in a distorted way. Their way of thinking is distorted due to their mind not being healthy enough to think under the influence of drugs or alcohol. To have a good perception, it is imperative to be alert and grasp the sensations that surround us in an adequate manner. So perception begins with the present, because by definition, we can only perceive the present. Since the past no longer exists and the future has not arrived yet, There is no use dwelling on these two spectrums. We cannot smell yesterday's apples, nor see tomorrow's watermelon. The sensuous perception. To understand why perception is a tri-dimensional process that occurs in time, let's use a very simple example. Eating an apple. It all begins with a desire or an intention to suffocate thirst, or hunger, or a craving, or all. So we cut a piece and see the color, smell the aroma. We open our mouth and take a bite. We perceive the taste and the texture, temperature, and consistency. All this takes place in the present. Immediately after, our memory, mental and organic, searches its files for parameters and comparisons with other apples that we ate in the past. It compares aroma, flavor, consistency, color, texture, temperature, juiciness. Finally, what our senses grasp in the present and the comparison to other similar experiences in the past is benchmarked vis-a-vis our original expectation, the desire that provoked the act of eating an apple. We will grade the experience accordingly. If it satisfied my thirst, hunger, or craving, then the experience will qualify as rewarding. But if it fell short, the experience will qualify as frustrating. The importance of a correct perception. Future desires trigger present acts that are compared to past experiences, and the combination of them creates our perception. In the present, we bite the apple. We compare it to similar past experiences, and we grade the experience based upon our original desire. But reality is a lot more sophisticated than biting an apple and calls for inferences that are a lot more complex and require more input than those provided by our mental or organic memory. We need to use tools that are more refined, such as our analytical skills or complex comparisons supported by elements that are sometimes known and others unknown. And so, an accurate perception can be the difference between a good understanding of reality and the fulfillment of our projects, or the failure of both, between inharmonious or destructive relationships with our environment, and ultimately between happiness and chaos in our lives. A real example of complex perception. Back in 2010, when the war on drugs in Mexico had just begun, the Mexican government began arresting drug lords, seizing drugs like never before, and advertising it, yet Mexicans felt more insecure than ever. The Bureau of Statistics, INEGI, published a survey on people's perception, and in it, the inhabitants of Acapulco, Mexico's most violent city, felt as insecure as those in Monterrey, who back then was pretty calm. People in Acapulco grew surrounded by violence. It's been part of their daily lives for generations, while the people in Monterrey, a city just 2 hours south of Laredo, Texas, had lived peacefully until then. So a single murder in Monterrey created as much perception of violence as 100 in Acapulco. Acapulco's murder rate was 100 times higher per each 100,000 inhabitants than Monterrey's. Being closer to the border, aspiring to a peaceful future like the people in San Antonio, having a less violent past created a perception of violence as bad as that of the people in Acapulco, where violence was 100 times higher and has been passed on from generation to generation. That is how radically different statistical readings create similar levels of perception when people weigh in past experiences. Circumstance. The reality of our circumstance is also tridimensional. It is defined by three essences. It is systemic, which means it is a network of systems that are interconnected and interact between them. These systems, as well as their interactions, can be very simple or very complex. We as humans tend to search for simpler systems over complex ones, although in many instances, as Leonardo da Vinci said, simplicity is the major of all complexities. Reality is also causal, never causal. Everything is a succession of causes and effects. Causes that become effects, and effects that become causes, in an endless chain of events that result from each other and depend on the outcome of each other, although their dependence is not always evident. Just like with a systemic essence, there are various levels of interdependence. Some events are very dependent and others more independent. Finally, reality has different degrees of permanence. Everything has a moment in time, and this moment can vary. It can be longer and be more permanent, or be shorter and momentary, but nothing lasts forever. The cube of circumstance, interdependent, causality, lasting, simple, complex, temporary, permanence, independent, systemic. The treasure of diversity. This is a fabulous example of how diverse cultures value each of the essences of reality differently. For Western civilization, permanence is preferable to change, while for Far Eastern cultures, it is the contrary. For them, the only thing that is permanent is change. For Muslims, Allah dictates everything that happens in the world, hence there is no cause and effect, only the will of the Creator. For others, the movement of a butterfly in Costa Rica can trigger a hurricane in Sumatra. Finally, in some cultures, nothing is more precious than to seize the moment, carpe diem, because they know that their passage in life is brief, while others are constantly searching for the fountain of eternal youth and would love to live forever. The author understands reality as complex, independent, changing, and transitory. I am more prone to find happiness in a world that is constantly changing, where the only certainty is death, and where ups and downs are the norm and not the exception. One model for different philosophies. It's time to see how uCUbe is a universal model, a map to guide us through the complex world we live in, regardless of our background or ideas. We will use two examples, one from the world of Christianity and one from Buddhism and Islam. For more than 1,500 years, Christians viewed poverty as a virtue and wealth as a sin. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. When Protestantism was conceived, this view changed and wealth was seen as a virtue and means to achieve the calling of God. The careful stewardship of possessions were seen as a very serious, God-given responsibility. The greater the possessions, the heavier the responsibility for using them for the glory of God and increasing them by restless effort. This is how uCUbe can explain both philosophies. So regardless if one is a Catholic or Protestant, uCUbe can guide him on the closest path to move from chaos to order. Cube of Christianity. It's hard for an empty sack to stand upright. The greater the possessions, the heavier the responsibility for using. Catholicism, poverty, condition, virtue, moral, sin, hearsay, Christ. Protestantism, them for the glory of God. Wealth, condition, poverty, hearsay, Christ, sin, moral, virtue. Easier for a camel, dogma, to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Islam versus Buddhism. According to Islam, Allah is the one who is creating the causes and producing the effects, and if it was not for the act of Allah, there could be no causes or effects. To believe that Allah was simply creating things with certain attributes without actively producing the effects of natural phenomena is contrary to true Islamic monotheism. What is reflected in nature as laws or constants of nature, such as the constants of gravity and electromagnetic forces, etc., are only manifestations of a very high level of consistency in Allah's act of creating causes and effects. The foundation of Buddhism is the law of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause and a condition. A cause and a condition combine to make an effect. All effects have a cause. All effects have a condition. There are no exceptions. Due to this relationship, the law of cause and effect can more clearly be known as the law of cause, condition, and effect. If a student studies hard, he will get good grades and eventually be employed. We can see clearly how the cause, studying diligently, led to the effect of getting good grades. How deeply you believe in the law of cause and effects shows how deeply you believe in Buddhism. Buddhist versus Islam faith. The proposition that fire burns is affirmed of the subject fire as a normative judgment, meaning the two are merely conjoined or bound together. However, there is complete validity in the two possible for fire to not burn, as well as for burning to occur without fire. What is observed is only correlation, and it is a logical fallacy to assume correlation entails causation. Being unbound is that it is logically permanent, independent, temporary, independent, complex, simple, interdependent, independent, interdependent, lasting, epistemic. Planting a watermelon seed yields a watermelon. Planting a radish seed yields a radish. You harvest only what you yourself have planted. It is impossible to plant a watermelon seed and get a radish, or plant a radish seed and get a watermelon. It will never happen in a million years. Complex, lasting, simple, systemic, temporary, permanence. The projects. Our projects are our tools to interact with the world around us. Projects bond the I with the circumstance. Our job, our family, our hobbies, all are projects which allow us to mingle, confront, or change the circumstance surrounding me. The Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset acknowledged this, but fell short. His famous phrase, "I am I and my circumstance, and if I do not save it, I do not save myself," is bidimensional. I on one side and circumstances on the other. But although it is implied, he fails to clarify how am I supposed to save my circumstance. He fails to mention the projects. George Bernard Shaw went a step further, saying that the people who get on in this world are the people who get up and look for the circumstances they want, and if they can't find them, make them. In other words, circumstances are the rulers of the weak, but they are the instruments of the wise. Once again, this connection is close, but not fully tridimensional. Tridimensional needs to include I, my circumstance, and my projects. Order, success, a project that is suitable or in sync with the circumstance, well implemented and accepted by the environment. The cube of projects, performance, execution, embraced, sloppy, rejected, in sync, defaced, adoption, chaos, failure, a project that is defaced with reality, badly executed and rejected by the environment, suitable. Introduction to karma. The cardinal doctrine of karma is the law of cause and effects in accordance with the maxim, "As you sow, so shall you reap." Karma is due to our actions, and our actions are due to our thoughts. Karma is what we have already created by our actions in the past that will bear result in the future. Therefore, there is nothing like fate in the absolute sense, controlling our lives. It is only the law of karma, therefore, which impels human beings to live a right kind of living. For failure to do so may create bad karma, which will make us suffer. The circumstances of the major events of our life, such as birth, death, or initiation into spiritual life, may be due to the uncanny operation of destiny. One's physical nature, heredity are determined. One cannot change one's parentage, one's innate temperament, or the fund of one's life energy. These are, in the main, determined. However, in another sense, our subconscious minds motivate desires, and in turn produce thoughts and actions, and that is called free will. Our will at each moment is free to fashion our future. It is the determinism to the extent that it is shadowed by the unchangeable law of karma. But life, which is guided by free will, does not follow any preordained pattern. Having this knowledge helps regulate our actions, thus making the individual wiser and better. Building our conscience is the path to good karma.